Numbers 1 through 10 is set at Mount Sinai. The tabernacle is freshly built, and Moses gives Israel instructions on how they can remain holy as they travel through the wilderness, which they do in chapters 11 through 21. It is terrible. Israel rebels against God 7 times, only to be greeted by Yahweh's surprising grace, 7 blessings from the mouth of a pagan sorcerer, Balaam. As Israel is grumbling down there on the plains of Moab, Balaam's looking down from the mountain and blessing them. They are on the plains of Moab, just east of the Jordan River, on the edge of the promised land, ready to enter into the promise made to Abraham. And it is about to be fulfilled. And here in the final chapters of the book of Numbers, we're dealing with a new generation, and the mood has certainly shifted from these negative chapters here at the center of the book of Numbers. There is a renewed optimism in chapters 26 to 36, which is reflected in a pattern we observed earlier in the book of Numbers, where all of the action, every narrative is introduced by the words of God. God says something, and then Moses and the people obey. God says something. He gives another instruction, and they obey. And that is characterized by the presence of blessing in the people of Israel and their camp. These are hopeful chapters here at the end of Numbers, because they begin with the Lord said to Moses, and they continue with as Yahweh commanded Moses. They were obedient. We see this pattern again and again throughout these final chapters. And all of this blessing that Israel receives, it is all land-centric. The focus of these final 11 chapters is all about the land. And therefore, you can notice this pattern between chapters 26 and 30 and 33 to 36, both of which are going to begin with a list, the census in chapters 26, a travelogue in chapters 33, and then they're going to have 4 land laws, we're calling them, laws that are relevant for Israel's life in the promised land in both of these cases. And in between these two list plus land law sections, Israel is given a foretaste of their future conquest of the land in chapters 31 and 32. Israel's victory over the Amorites in chapter 31 is followed up by a victory over the Midianites in chapters 31. Now let's jump to the beginning of this section, chapter 26, the second census in the book of Numbers. And it seems that the purpose of the second census is that Israel is turning over a new leaf. The old is gone. Quite literally, all the old people died from the first generation, and we're starting over with a new generation. Look at how this is emphasized at the end of Numbers 26. So here we are. Take a census, another census. Everyone that's 20 years old and upward who are able to go to war, this time to beat those Canaanites. And look at the end. It says that those who were listed by Moses and Eleazar, not Aaron, Aaron's dead now, in the plains of Moab, not in the wilderness of Sinai, among those listed, not one of them was present on the list in Numbers chapter 1. And not one of them is left except Caleb and Joshua, the faithful spies from Numbers 13. So we are starting over with a new batch of Adam and Eve's ready to enter into this new promised land, the Garden of Eden land, with the same potential and possibility, which was just vibrant in the opening 10 chapters of the book of Numbers. But if we compare these two censuses, chapter 1 and chapter 26, you'll notice a bit of a dip in the population. I wonder why that is. So, census in chapter 1 has 603,000, census in 26 has 601,000. Now, why is that? Well, we can't ignore the fact that in addition to the judgment pronounced on Israel in chapter 14, where no one from the first generation is going to enter the promised land, they're all going to die in the wilderness. In addition to that, there are numerous individual judgments which take place throughout the book of Numbers as Israel is going through the wilderness and rebelling against God time and time again. This little chart just attempts to tally the death toll of Israel in the wilderness, starting back in the book of Exodus. The first time that God acts in judgment against Israel is when they commit idolatry in Exodus 32 with the golden calf. 3,000 die there. God sends a plague, an unspecified amount of people die as well. And now jumping to the book of Numbers, fire is going to be sent out from the Lord. In addition to fiery serpents here in chapter 21, numerous times plagues are sent in response to Israel's blatant sin and rebellion against their suzerain, Yahweh. This particular plague, in response to Korah's rebellion, kills 14,700 people. And then another plague in chapter 25, 24,000 people died who yoked themselves to Baal in Peor. You add them all up, and it's a little bit unprecise because many of those who died in the wilderness are unspecified. We don't have their numbers. But the main point seems to be that if Israel was truly fruitful and multiplying during this period of their wandering through the wilderness, you would think this number would go up, but in fact it went down, therefore clearly stating that Israel is not blessed of God, or this first generation was not blessed of God. But you'll notice a couple of other curiosities with this list. The largest one seems to be what is going on with the tribe of Simeon. They had 59,000 and they went down to 22,000, a 37,000 drop. What is happening here to the poor Simeonites? Well, we can't be sure because we're really not given that much detail, but a single Simeonite, one person, his name is Zimri. Don't name any of your kids Zimri. Zimri's a bad guy. He is a Simeonite, and he, in chapter 25, it says that he took a Moabite woman into his tent in the sight of all Israel and in the sight of Moses. And that action, in addition to the other idolatry and sin that Israel is participating in here in chapter 25, results in a plague that's sent against Israel. And it says that 24,000 people die as a result of that plague. Maybe those 24,000 are all in the tribe of Simeon, and that kind of helps us understand why that particular tribe dipped so much. Well, despite these sobering reflections, chapter 26, the census, is intended to depict a fresh generation which is going forth in the blessing of God to receive his promises. This is a positive thing. This is the second generation we're talking about, not the rebellious first generation. And therefore, what follows after this census are 4 land laws. These are laws which assume Israel's success entering into and possessing the promised land. So let's look at a couple of these laws. The first one, the daughters of Zelophehad, they come up and approach Moses, having identified a gap in the law of Moses. They say, our father had 4 daughters and no sons. What will happen to his inheritance in the land? Every family, every clan is supposed to receive their own inheritance. But our father is going to get no inheritance because women cannot inherit the land. Here's our solution, they say. Moses, let us women receive an inheritance in the promised land. And Moses talks to God about that, and God's like, those daughters of Zelophehad are completely right. Give them an inheritance in the land. That's because this promised land, it is intended to be an eternal possession of the people of Israel, and it is not acceptable that it should be taken away from them under any circumstances. Therefore, a little narrative like this is intended to be very encouraging for Israel, so that they can know the land won't be taken from me and my family or my descendants either. Next law, Moses is going to plead with Yahweh that he would appoint a man over the congregation to lead them, specifically to lead them into the land. Next, following this, we have 2 chapters, chapters 28 and 29, 71 verses outlining in extreme detail the offerings that Israel is supposed to bring at each of their holy days, their feasts, their festivals, the Sabbath, the new moons. And if you count up all of the offerings they're supposed to bring, wow, it's a pretty big number. Take a look at this. let's see, that was big number 2. The calendar of offerings, numbers 28 and 29. Every day, morning and evening, Israel is to provide 2 lambs for Yahweh to be presented as a burnt offering. Every Sabbath, they were to bring another 2 lambs. Every month, they were to bring 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and 1 goat. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is a 7-day feast, and every day it is specified what Israel is to bring. The same thing is true with the Feast of Booths, but they kick it off to an 8th day as well. What's the point of all this? I like how it is explained by Gordon Wenham in his commentary in the Tyndale series. He says that here again, with these 2 chapters, the giving of these laws act as a strong affirmation of the promise to Joshua and the rest of the people. Every year in the future, priests will have to offer 113 bulls, all of these rams and lambs, and I differ slightly on the totals here, but look at this. They must also offer more than a ton of flour. Where does flour come from? And 1,000 bottles of oil and wine. Where do those things come from? They come from the land. Clearly, Israel is destined to be a prosperous agricultural community there in the land. These laws about sacrifices then contribute to the note of triumph that grows louder and louder as the border of Canaan is reached. So again, more positive laws we have. And then the last one, this one's kind of tricky, to be honest. Chapter 30 relates to vows that women may make, promises. And it says that a husband is, he may either confirm or void or nullify a vow that his wife makes. And this legislation seems to ensure that the woman, the wife, is to remain under the protective influence of her husband. This is not a law that looks down on women. Rather, it is a law that is intended to protect women if their husband is away at war, because, and that's an important detail, because the text indicates that on the day that her husband hears of the vow that she makes, on that day he is enabled to nullify that vow. And therefore, women will be protected even if their husband is going away and fighting in order to claim the land, which is exactly what Israel will do in the very next chapter, chapters 31 and 32. So 31 in particular is going to give a foretaste of Israel's future conquest of the land of Canaan. And this chapter indicates that their coming battles, the wars that they're going to engage in the promised land, that is not a normal military engagement, not by a long stretch. These battles, this war is a holy war. And this is a very specific term in biblical studies, and it refers to a war which is specifically sanctioned by God. God is the one who commands you to engage in this military battle. And we see this as clearly the case because in chapter 25, the chapter ends where Yahweh commands Israel to take vengeance against Midian, which they do in chapter 31. And then secondly, this form of holy war necessitates the elimination of all of the inhabitants of the land so that they do not persuade Israel to worship their gods like they did here in chapter 25. Additionally, the plunder that the soldiers receive as a result of their battles, that plunder is holy, and therefore all of it, or at least a portion of it, belongs to Yahweh himself. And so this chapter 31, just goes on, 22 verses describing in detail how that plunder is to be divvied up to the Levites and to the priests. And then finally, this is a war that will be characterized by the miraculous. Despite the fact that 12,000 Israelites went to battle against the Midianites, not a single one died. Look at this. You send 1,000 from each of the tribes of Israel to go to war. And then when the commanders got back, they're like, Moses, this is crazy. Your servants counted the men of war who were under our command. And you know what? There's not a single man missing. nobody died. Clearly, this is a miraculous battle that took place against the Midianites. And again, this is intended to serve as encouragement for the Israelites. This is what your battles in the Promised Land should look like. Well, this victory took place way down in the south. Midian is way down there on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba. Let me show you where Midian is located on the map. So we saw this map earlier. This is Israel's defeat of Sihon and Og in chapter 21. This is on the east side of the Jordan River in the Transjordan, but Midian is way down here. It is located, okay, so Israel is located right now in the plains of Moab, just north of the Dead Sea. There's the Dead Sea right there, and Midian is way down here on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba. However, these two chapters, 21 and 31, are linked together because right after chapter 31, Israel's defeat of Midian, we read about the Transjordan tribes' inheritance and settling on the east side of the Jordan, land which was claimed after they defeated these two opponents. Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben are going to settle on the east side of the Jordan River, and this is described in chapter 32 of the book of Numbers. Well, the text doesn't specify whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, that Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh settled in the Transjordan. However, in refusing God's gift on God's own terms, God didn't say you can have the land on the east side of the Jordan. He said west side. We find out many generations later that these tribes are the first ones to be defeated by the Syrians in 2 Kings chapter 10. So perhaps they should have followed God's instructions as given. Well, it's possible that these chapters that we just looked at, chapters 26 to 32, it's possible that just like Numbers 1 to 6, they are replaying the literary and thematic pattern presented first in Genesis 1 through 9. And thereby presenting the second generation as a new Adam ruling over a new Garden of Eden in the Promised Land. Let's take a look at some of these parallels between Genesis 1 to 9 and Numbers 26 to 32. All right, I don't believe we need this anymore. Okay. So, further echoes of the book of Genesis here in Numbers. Well, just like Numbers 1, it opens with a census, and a census that lists a lot of people. So over the course of time, Israel has been fruitful and has multiplied, which is what we have emphasized here in Genesis chapter 1. So we kind of start out with that parallel, which we already observed from Numbers chapter 1. And then after that, notice how in the book of Genesis, both male and female are equally in the image of God, and God says to both of them together, have dominion over the earth, rule and subdue it. Well, notice how the next story in Numbers 27 is about women inheriting alongside men. It's as if they have a shared responsibility over the garden land in Canaan. Fascinating. Well, if we continue in the book of Genesis to the next chapter, chapter 2, Adam is commissioned to rule over the beasts. He gave names to all of them. But this is curious. The next section, in the second half of chapter 27, this is when Moses calls on Yahweh to appoint a leader to lead the people. And Yahweh says it's going to be Joshua. And look, it says that may the people not be as sheep without a shepherd. This is the very first time that Israel's leader is described as a shepherd. But curious, isn't it, that it's as if Joshua is described as someone who is ruling over the animals, just like Adam is ruling over the animals. Quite an interesting comparison. Look next, what happens next in the story of Genesis is there's the 7-day rest, which God pronounces as holy. And next in the book of Numbers, we have 2 full chapters which just go on at great detail to describe Israel's ritual calendar, which is all based on the sequence of sevens The Sabbath itself is highlighted in great detail. And then what about that curious law about men being able to void the vows of their wife? I think this is setting up Israel's camp as a place which will prevent future Genesis 3 moments. See, this is kind of like a figurative metaphor that's active here in chapter 30, where Adam was present with his wife and could have stopped her from taking the fruit. At least that's what it seems to be teaching here in verse 6 of chapter 3 here in Genesis. Just like the man is capable of protecting his wife from a potentially dangerous step here in chapter 30 of the book of Numbers. And then right after the fall of Adam, we have the fall of Cain, where he rose up against his brother. But in chapter 31 of Numbers, this sibling rivalry is a God-ordained sibling rivalry, where Israel is commanded of God to attack the Midianites, who we know from Genesis 25 are relatives of the Israelites, because Midian is a son of Abraham by another wife. And then finally, the Transjordan tribes, they will build little arks of refuge for their children and for their animals, for children and for animals on the far side of the Jordan before they cross through the waters in order to keep their covenant. Just like Noah built an ark of refuge for his children and for his animals, after which he passed through the waters and made a covenant with Yahweh. Now, it seems that the purpose of all of these subtle little literary allusions is that if Israel were to remain faithful to Yahweh's words, then they have the potential of establishing a Garden of Eden land there in the Promised Land. They can be the new Adam and Eve if they follow God's laws. Well, the final section of the book of Numbers, 33 to 36, is introduced by another list. This is a list of all of the campsites that Israel stayed at while they went through the wilderness. Yahweh commands Moses, write down the starting place, stage by stage, everywhere where you went. And 42 is a curious number, isn't it? I mean, by my calculations, 42 is 6 times 7. 7 being very important. Of course, there are 42 laws in the book of the covenant in Exodus 21 to 23. So clearly we're playing with some important numbers here. And there are many of them which are not, many of these campsites are not listed anywhere else in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers. Specifically, campsites number 15 through 32, these are reflective of those silent years, those 38 years between chapters 19 and chapter 20, where we don't get any detail of what happened with those rebellious Israelites during that time. Well, chapter 33 is going to conclude with a command and a warning to drive out the Canaanites from the land. And if you don't do this, then they will be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your side. And so Numbers is going to conclude, the whole book of Numbers is going to conclude with these 4 land laws specifying the precise boundaries of the promised land, and then setting aside cities for both the Levites and as cities of refuge for those who are guilty of manslaughter but not of murder. And finally, all these laws are going to be concluded with a kind of inclusio. The laws began with the daughters of Zelophehad, and they are going to end with the daughters of Zelophehad, this time requiring that they marry within their clan. So they're from Manasseh, I believe, and they're not allowed to marry those from another tribe. And again, the purpose of that legislation is that the gift of the land is always to remain an eternal possession of the tribes of Israel. It's not to be taken from one tribe to another. At least that is God's desire if Israel is faithful to him, because he is the God who dwells in their midst. He leads them through the wilderness. He provides for all of their needs. And this is a God who is faithful when Israel is not faithful. And not even Israel's sin will prevent him from accomplishing his purpose to bless the nations by blessing Israel, because he has promised to raise up a singular Israelite, an Israelite who will be faithful as he is faithful, and who, like the bronze serpent in chapter 21 of the book of Numbers, was lifted up on a pole, so this Israelite, this coming lion king from the tribe of Judah, he too will be lifted up so that whoever looks at him will have life and be with him a co-heir in the kingdom, to the glory of God forever and ever. Amen.